So in this video, you're going to learn how the sleeper berth provisional works. If we take a look at the 14-hour rule, we already know that everything that's less than 10 hours gets counted as work. We already know that everything that's less than 8 hours in the sleeper berth gets counted as work. But what happens when we rest 8 hours? Or 9 hours? Or 9 hours and a half? Or 9 hours and 45 minutes? Because we already know what happens when we rest 10 hours. It's just going to reset and stop the count for the 14-hour rule. We already know what happens when there's less than 8 hours in the sleeper berth, and that's going to get counted as work. But what happens when we rest from 8 hours to 9 hours and 45 minutes? When we rest from 8 hours to 9 hours and 45 minutes, the sleeper berth provisional applies. Now, as I said, here, in order for the sleeper berth provisional to work, we would need from 8 hours to 9 hours and 45 minutes in the sleeper berth, followed by a minimum of 2 hours in the off-duty or sleeper berth section. We see here, it shows us what the sleeper berth provisional is. The sleeper berth provisional allows you to split the required 10 hours of rest. The 8 hours to 9 hours and 45 minutes in the sleeper do not get counted as work. However, they do not stop the count. This by itself does not stop the count. It doesn't get counted to the count, but it doesn't stop the count. In order for you to stop the count for the 14-hour rule, you need the additional 2 hours in either the off-duty or the sleeper berth section. It says here, have to have a combination of both for the count to stop. Let's look at an example. I have 2 logs here with me, day number 1 and day number 2. Now, if we first look at day 1, we already know where our calculation point is. We already know where we're going to start counting the rules from, 4:30. From 4:30, we have to count the 14-hour rule, the 11-hour rule, and the break rule. Let's start with the 14-hour rule. The 14-hour rule, if we count 14 hours forward from 4:30, we're going to land at 6:30 a.m. Here it is. We're going to land here at 6:30 a.m. That's where our 14-hour limit is. Now, if we start counting all this time via our chart, we know that this hour is going to get counted since it's in the on-duty not driving section of the log. We know that all this driving time is going to get counted. But what about the sleeper berth time? How many hours is it? Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have a total of 8 hours in the sleeper berth section here. Now, back to the chart. Everything that's less than 8 hours in the log is counted to the 14-hour rule as work. But the sleeper berth provisional says that everything that's from 8 hours to 9 hours and 45 minutes in the sleeper does not get counted as work. However, it doesn't stop the count. So, in this log, we already know that these 8 hours are not going to get counted as work. So in reality, our 14-hour limit is not here at 6:30. Our 14-hour limit is going to be farther down the log. We need to know where that 14-hour limit is. So we have to count from our calculation point. We're going to count 14 hours forward without counting these 8 hours of sleeper berth. So in that case, let's count one by one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We stop counting because these are 8 hours, which we're not going to count. And then we keep counting here. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Our 14-hour limit from this calculation point over here Reminder, we are not in this calculation point yet. We're still counting from this calculation point. From this calculation point, our 14-hour limit is at 2:30 p.m. the next day. All because we rested 8 hours in the sleeper berth. That did not get counted. So, here is our 14-hour limit. If we look closely, we counted all this. We counted all this as work. This is not considered work. And then this is considered work again. So all this got counted. And then from here, we have 10 hours and a half of rest. Now, so from right here, if we wanted to drive again after 2:30, we would have to ensure, let's look at our chart again. We would have to ensure a minimum of 2 hours in either the off-duty or sleeper berth section. In this log, this driver went to a complete 10-hour break, and we don't know if he continued to drive the next day. But this driver could have continued going if he would have just rested 2 hours. He would have continued to drive. He would have been able to continue to drive. So that's what happens when you rest 8 hours in the sleeper. This could have been 9 hours, this could have been 9 hours and 45 minutes, and it still wouldn't have gotten counted as work. Now, within those 14 hours, we need to check the 11-hour rule. The 11-hour rule says that within 14 hours of work, you're not supposed to drive more than 11 hours. So from here, if we look closely, we drove 5 before those 8 hours. And then we drove 5.5 the next day. So in total, we have 10 hours and a half. So therefore, we are good with the 11-hour rule. There's no violation with the 14-hour rule nor the 11-hour rule here. Just keep in mind, we're still counting from this calculation point, not from here. This one is not open yet. We're still counting from here. From here, we already counted the 14-hour rule. We already counted the 11-hour rule. Now we have to count the break rule. From 4:30, we count 8 hours ahead. 8 hours forward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 at 12:30 the next day. Now, law says if you want to continue to drive after those 8 hours, you need to ensure a 30-minute break, a minimum 30 minutes in the off-duty or sleeper berth. Now here, he did not drive after those 8 hours. He actually rested, so he's good. There's no violation there. From this calculation point, we now move on to the next. We now move on to the calculation point here at 6:30. We disregard everything in the past and we just focus on this calculation point now, from here on out. From 6:30, if we count 14 hours ahead, where are we going to land? We're going to land at 8:30 p.m. From here, there's no 14-hour violation because we stopped and we started resting our 10-hour break way before. What about our 11-hour rule? We did not drive more than 11 hours, so we're okay. What about our break rule? From Houston to Laredo, it's not going to take more than 8 hours to get here. So therefore, we don't really need a break as well. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If we're still going to drive after 2:30, we would have needed to ensure a break somewhere in San Antonio. So there's no violations in this log. Now, let's take off day 2 and replace it with this one. This one's a little different. This log we see the same thing, the same load, the same trip from Laredo to Houston, Houston, Pasadena, back to Laredo. Now, here it shows where he rested those 2 hours and then drove again. So we already checked our rules from this calculation point right here. We had mentioned that from 4:30, if you count 14 hours ahead, we're going to land at 6:30. Now, we found out that our 14-hour limit wasn't here because we had 8 hours of rest. And when we have 8 hours of rest, those 8 hours do not get counted as work. Therefore, when we count our 14 hours from here, we do not count this. So it extended our 14-hour limit from 6:30 all the way to 2:30. Now, from here, we had mentioned that if he wanted to continue driving, all he needed was 2 hours of rest. When this driver rested those 8 hours, and then followed by these 2 hours right here, he had already closed down this calculation point right here. He closed it as if he rested 10 hours, but he didn't do it with 10 hours consecutively. He did it in a sleeper berth provisional with a minimum of 8 hours in the sleeper berth, followed by a minimum of 2 hours. Keep in mind that these 8 hours have to be in the sleeper berth and cannot be in the off duty. So we already closed our calculation point from here. We go to the next now. Now we focus on the calculation point over here at 6:30. So from 6:30, we focus on everything that's in the future, nothing in the past. So from 6:30, we count all 3 rules, starting with the 14-hour rule. If we count 14 hours ahead from 6:30, we're going to land and result at 8:30 p.m. We need to know if all this got counted as work. We know that everything that's on duty gets counted. We know that everything that's in driving gets counted. What about these 2 hours here in the off duty? They also get counted. Even though they work with the sleeper berth provisional, they still get counted because it's less than 10 hours. These 2 hours did not get counted from this calculation point because there were a combination with these 8 hours. So when we, from this calculation point, once we reached these 2 hours right here, we had already secured 8 hours. We just needed 2 hours to stop the count. So that's why they did not get counted. Now, from this calculation point, remember, we're talking about this one now. From here, we count 14 hours ahead. We resulted at 8:30 p.m. Now, we know that this got counted as work. This too. This gets counted as work as well. But he already has 2 hours here. What does he need after this drive time to stop the 14-hour count? When you have a period of 2 hours, you only need 8 hours here in the sleeper berth to continue to drive. So from here, 14 hours, he did not break because he has 2, and we would have to check the next log to see if he completed his 8 hours. So from here in this log, there's no 14-hour violation. What about 11-hour rule? The 11-hour rule states that within 14 hours, he's only subject to drive up to 11 hours. He only drove 10 hours and a half, so he's good. What about the break? From here, if you count 8 hours ahead, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He rested his 30 minutes, his minimum 30 minutes, before he started to drive again. So he's good. So from this calculation point, we're okay. We go to the next now. We go to this one. In this calculation point, we focus everything that's forward, nothing that's back. From here, we can now find out how many hours this driver can drive if this would have been 8 hours. If this would have been 8 hours, these 8 hours would not get counted. If this would have been 8 hours in total, this person's 14-hour limit would not be at 5:30 the next day. Because from 3:30 to 5:30, that's 14 hours. It wouldn't have been, the 14-hour limit wouldn't have been at 5:30 because this would have been 8 hours, and these 8 hours wouldn't have gotten counted. Now, from this calculation point, we know how many hours of drive time he had. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He had 5 hours here. How many hours can we drive within a 14-hour period? 11. Since he has 5 hours here, after these 8 hours were completed of rest, this driver could have driven 6 hours after these 8 hours. Let's take a look at another example. Now here, we have the 1st of June, and we're going to combine it with various examples of the second day after that. As you can see here, we have a couple of examples of day 2, which we're going to go over. Okay. So in these logs, we can see that there's a 14-hour violation here at 9 a.m. Let's see why. From 5, that's where our first calculation point is. From here, we're going to go ahead and count 14 hours ahead. From 5, we count 14 hours ahead, and we're going to land at 7 the next day. Here at 7, that's where our 14-hour limit is. But in order for us to ensure that that's where our 14-hour limit is, we have to check to see if all these hours are considered work. Starting with these 30 minutes of on duty not driving, yes, they're considered work. What about this whole time of driving? Yes, it's considered as work. What about from 12 to 8? We have 8 hours here off duty. Now, if we look at our chart, it says here that the 14-hour duty considers everything that's less than 10 hours in the off duty as work. So here we see that these 8 hours are less than 10 hours in off duty. Therefore, it is taken as work. So here, our 14-hour limit, that's where it really is. In order for us to drive after these 14 hours, we either need a 10-hour break without interruptions or a sleeper berth provisional, which we cannot do here because we have 8 hours here off duty. So when we drove after those 14 hours here at 9 a.m., that's when we're in violation. Now, what should have this driver done? This driver should have taken these 8 hours that were off duty and put them in sleeper berth. If these 8 hours would have been in sleeper berth, there wouldn't have been a violation here. Because if these 8 hours would have been here in the sleeper, the 14-hour limit wouldn't have been here because these 8 hours wouldn't have gotten counted as work. Let's look at another example. If we count calculation point our hours from here we count 14 hours ahead, we're going to land here at 7 again. Now, we need to check to see if all these hours are considered work. Starting with these, yes, they're all considered work. What about these 7 hours and a half that we have here? These 7 hours and a half, if we look at our chart, it says everything that's less than 8 hours is considered work. So here, where a 14-hour limit is, since these 7 hours and a half are going to get counted as work, you know, the hours keep counting. And since we have this driving time after those 14 hours, that's where our 14-hour limit violation is. Not our 14-hour limit. That's where our 14-hour violation is. Let's look at another example. This driver should have rested 30 more minutes before continuing to drive. If he had rested 30 more minutes, making it a total of 8 hours in the sleeper, that would have made it a sleeper berth provisional. Therefore, the 14-hour limit wouldn't have been here. It would have been farther out. Let's look at another example. Okay, let's look at this example. Again, if we count from this calculation point over here, we count 14 hours ahead, we're going to land right at 7. Now, we need to check to see if all this gets counted as work. This is counted as work. these 8 hours are not counted as work. Therefore, we have a sleeper berth provisional here. Now, we have to know where our 14-hour limit is. In order for us to find out, we have to count 14 hours from here, from our calculation point. We have to count 14 hours ahead without counting these 8 hours. So from here, we count 14 ahead. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We do not count this. And then we keep counting here. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Here at 3 p.m., that's where our 14-hour limit is. And in this log, if this driver would have continued driving, he would have been in violation. What this driver did wrong here is he got his 8 hours right, but when he rested this other time, he did not rest the 2 hours complete. The 2 hours are required to go with the sleeper berth provisional so we can go ahead and stop the count for the 14-hour count. So here he should have rested 2 hours in total, which he only rested an hour and a half. And if we look at our chart, it says down here that in order for a sleeper berth provisional to work, we need a minimum of 8 hours in the sleeper berth, followed by a minimum of 2 hours in either the off-duty or the sleeper berth. So, in order for this driver to continue driving without having a violation, he should have rested an additional 30 minutes, so it can be 2 hours in total. Like we see here. This is the same log again. From here, if we count 14 hours ahead, one might think that the 14-hour limit is here. But since we see 8 hours here in the sleeper, these 8 hours are not going to get counted. Therefore, that 14-hour limit is not going to be there. 14-hour limit in reality is farther away. Where exactly? Here at 3. If we count 14 hours ahead from here, without counting these 8 hours, we're going to land over here at 3. Now, within those 14 hours, we already have 8 hours and 2 hours, meaning that when we rested these 2 hours, the 14-hour count stopped. So now, since it stopped, we now have to count from here. Here we see a load from Laredo to Dallas and then Fort Worth. We delivered in Dallas at 8. And then we picked up in Fort Worth here at 12. So, let's take a look at this log. From here is our next calculation point. This is our next calculation point right here. From here, we need to count all 3 rules. Now, here, we left this log open because, in reality, there's a question mark here. Now, the question is, can this driver make it back to Laredo with this same log? Yes. Because from here, from 8 a.m., that's where our calculation point is. We have to count 14 hours ahead. From 8 a.m., if we count 14 ahead, we're going to land right at 10. So, as long as this driver gets to Laredo before 10, he'll be all right. Which, how many hours does he have to get to Laredo? 9 hours in total. Because here at 1 through 10, that's 9 hours. So this driver has 9 hours to get to Laredo, which he should make it no problem. So that's how the sleeper berth provision works. This sleeper berth provision is mainly used by Texas drivers. Our Texas drivers are the ones that mainly use it. You know, because sometimes we're not able to rest the 10 hours completely up in Houston or in Dallas. So sometimes we have to split it into 8 and then 2. The 8 we rest when we're about to deliver. That's why we got to leave a little early. And the 2 hours, we rest them while we're waiting to pick up. So that's how it works. Any questions, feel free to ask them now.